Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the sixth webinar in our Pandemics and Society series. Today's event is The Road Ahead, Next Steps After the UN General Assembly. It will focus on the reflections of our panelists after the UN General Assembly's sessions on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. I'll now pass it to our moderator today, Jennifer Nuzzo, Professor of Epidemiology and Director of the Pandemic Center at Brown University School of Public Health, to get things started.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being able to join this important discussion. Last week, the United Nations General Assembly met in New York City, and the event brought together world leaders to discuss a range of topics from climate change, food insecurity, AI, to pandemic preparedness. At the high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, world leaders committed to strengthening preparedness for biological emergencies. The World Health Organization's Director General has called this declaration historic, but others have raised questions and expressed cynicism about countries' likelihood of fulfilling their promises. So where does this all leave us? The road ahead from UNGA is the topic of today's discussion, and we'll focus on highlights from the UNGA, particularly the high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. We want to discuss what was accomplished, what concerns there may be, and basically where do we go next as we all work collectively to increase preparedness for future biological threats. So to help us unpack all of this, we are incredibly fortunate to be joined by three esteemed panelists, each of whom has a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. Our guests today are Wilmot James, who's Professor of Practice in Health Services Policy and Practice here at the Brown University School of Public Health. Dr. James is also a Senior Advisor to the Pandemic Center. Wilmot hosted a side meeting at the UNGA event with the World Economic Forum, so he'll be sharing some insights on that. We are also incredibly fortunate to be joined by Seth Berkley, who's currently now serving as Senior Advisor to the Pandemic Center. Prior to this, he was the former head of Gavi, which is the Vaccine Alliance, which has, as many of you know, worked for more than 20 years to ensure that children around the world have access to life-saving vaccines. And we're also joined by Eloise Todd, who is Executive Director and co-founder of the Pandemic Action Network, which is an organization that was created in April of 2020 to bring together organizations all over the world that are working on COVID response and to advocate for a better future. Each of our speakers has enormous wealth, so we'll just get into the discussion. So this is meant to be conversational, and I think to kind of kick off our conversation, I might turn to you, Eloise, because you've been following the events from UNGA quite closely, and I would very much welcome your perspectives on what happened at the meetings, where are we, what do you think the big takeaways are?
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks for inviting me and Pandemic Action Network to be part of this discussion. So we had this high-level meeting last Wednesday. What did it all mean? People have called it historic. We would say, well, it's historic that it actually happened, that we finally got a high-level meeting. But unfortunately, the contents and outcome of that meeting and the declaration were not historic. We would call it a missed opportunity. That's how we're characterizing it. And we really think that, as colleagues have said, there's sort of many watchwords and buzzwords in the declaration. There's very little in terms of concrete steps, concrete commitments. Unfortunately, we did not get a high-level council to convene leaders in times of crisis. We did not get a big show of support from political leaders. Just a handful came at that highest level of political leadership to turn up. We didn't get real progress on equity. Really, that has to be the heart and soul of a future pandemic preparedness agenda, learning from the lessons of COVID. No new finance on the table and no accountability framework. So we're pleased that it happened. We're pleased that there was a lot of support from health ministers, that some leaders turned up. We want to acknowledge that, but really, in terms of content and the process on the day, it was a real letdown. We didn't get enough time to speak as civil society in the room either. But we are not down in the dumps. We are looking ahead, and we're very focused on action. and at Pandemic Action Network, we've launched our Agenda for Action, really springboarding forward to look at all the things we need to do in 2024. We launched that just the week before the high-level meeting. We've already got more than 100 organizations signed up from around the world, and that will be our calling card and our mandate to convene and push for really ambitious outcomes on the all-important Pandemic Accord, which is really target number 1 now for 2024.
Thanks for that really thoughtful assessment, and also for your work in trying to push these issues forward. It's really great to have people who are laser focused on using this moment and taking action and making sure that these issues don't fall off of leaders' agenda. I think I'm going to turn to Wilmot. Wilmot, you were involved in some side meetings with the private sector. I'm just wondering, what were your big takeaways from the discussions happening in UNGA with, you know, not just government leaders, but also private sector leaders and others on key issues? What sorts of, what do you think the highlights were?
I just wanted to amplify Eloise's point about the fact that we have a small window to get serious, high-level commitments on the question of equity, for example, and we were looking for a binding stipulation when it comes to the sharing of patents and tech transfer. We were also looking for conditions to be attached to taxpayer-funded initiatives, and it was disappointing that obviously didn't happen, and we're somewhat skeptical about the fact that it will happen before the deadline, because that sets the tone for discussions around vaccines. I'm sure Seth will have a lot to say about that, but I attended a side meeting on that. And the main item I wanted to reflect on was a meeting that I co-chaired with Jennifer on pathogen surveillance, and that had an audience of about 20 CEOs of companies, and then led by key leaders from the public sector, including Chikwe Kwezu, Jeremy Farrar, Ashish Jha, we had Jean Kaseya from the Africa CDC there, and also a Vice Minister, Marcel from Brazil. So the key takeaway from that meeting was that there was major private sector support to share finance, expertise, systems, as we try and develop a far more robust and globally coherent surveillance system. And that was a major interest in that area. And that has to be aligned to what happens on the demand side, involving the WHO hub. And I must tell you, I left that meeting feeling very, very positive. If we are able to translate the commitments into practice, and construct operational models where that's possible, because the challenge is immense. I worry about the lack of finance, sustainable finance for that. I worry about the lack of sustainable finance from national governments in particular, because global organizations can support that effort. So the question of finance is a major issue. COVID-19 showed what damage it does in the trillions of dollars to economies. The investment required is a fraction of that to get it right. So there's a great concern about sustainable financing when it comes to governments, and there is a great concern about, again, equity in terms of this is, pandemics are global. So just to say, from that particular meeting, I was both enthusiastic about private sector support, but we really have to get down to the kind of brass tacks and turn that support into something meaningful on a practical level. And to do that, we need some major investments, and that, I have some worries about that.
Thanks for reflecting on that. I too, having had the privilege of participating with you in that discussion with the private sector, was really struck by how much enthusiasm and interest and just energy there was in the non-governmental sector, we should call it, for kind of rolling up sleeves, trying to make things better so that we don't have to go through these events again. And yet I really sort of contrast that with what I think was sort of a tepid governmental level commitment. So really interesting disconnect there. But I want to turn to Seth. Seth, you are famous for getting governments to commit to things. So would love to know your thoughts on sort of where you think the energy and commitment is now, and sort of what your takeaway is given the moment and what you've heard come out of UNGA, and just with a path ahead.
So thanks, Jen, and it's great to follow Eloise and Wilmot here, because they made many of the points that I would make. But let me just build on a couple of them. And so first of all, to say, why is this important? It's evolutionarily certain we're going to have more pandemics, and there's evidence to suggest that the frequency is going to increase. Some, modeling has suggested 2% increase per year at the frequency of these occurring, but it isn't only pandemic. It's going to be outbreaks that can turn into pandemics of severe disease. And so this needs to be of global concern. And Wilmot already talked about the cost. I mean, the estimated cost was $12 trillion. So, this is not something we should be penny wise and pound foolish about in terms of dealing with. So, where are we? I agree with Eloise's comments on what came out of the meeting. And I think we turn our eyes now to the pandemic accord, but the pandemic accord is a challenge. And I think if you look at where it is right now, there's brackets all through it, and UN language, that means areas of disagreement, and some big fundamental areas of disagreement on the issue of equity that Wilmot talked about, on the issues of intellectual property, on whether and what type of situation should be there for march-in rights. Of course, they're trying to negotiate this side by side with a review and updating of the international health regulations, which is where some of those are held, and how that's going to play out. Now, one thing that came out of this UN General Assembly was a deadline of May 2024 for having agreement from the intergovernmental non-negotiating body and having a document, and we'll see whether we can get there. But let me just finish and say, I think the challenge is, people were really tired after COVID. And we have a history of panic, neglect, panic, neglect, panic, neglect. We saw it with Ebola. We've seen it with other diseases as well. And the challenge really here is, with all of the other calls right now, which is rebuilding societies, dealing with Ukraine, dealing with the environmental disasters, global warming, there isn't a lot of money that is being put on the table. So is there money? There is money obviously available. But to do that, one has to have the desire to move it forward. So this is where innovative ways of working together, using existing pots, innovative financing mechanisms are going to be important, because what I don't see is massive amounts of new money put on the table. But of course, if the world was rational, it would do that, because what we spend, for example, on defense globally, and you look at this, is even more a reality of risk for the world. But, it's only a fraction of that. So we need a shift in mindset, and I'm not sure we've gotten there yet.
Yeah, so thank you for those sobering statistics and the reminder that, what we all live through, as horrific as it is not going to be the last. And, at the Pandemic Center, we always talk about, living in the sort of the age of pandemic threats. We don't know when the next one's going to be. We don't know if it's going to be a full-blown pandemic like COVID. It could be worse. It could be smaller. Nonetheless, we're focused on building societal-wide resilience so that when these things happen, they just don't upend our lives in the way that this last one did. And that's very much within reach. But it requires commitment and action. And I think we're at this moment where there are a lot of question marks about what that kind of commitment and action will be. Now, Seth, you raised the pandemic accord. And for those that don't know, there's a kind of treaty in process, if you want to call it that. Some lawyers might chime in and correct my language there.
But they changed it from a treaty, because the idea is that the U.S. will not pass a treaty in our current political environment. So they've changed it to an accord. And I think that's an important nuance, because we used to live in a world where people could do treaties, but very hard to imagine getting 2/3 of, the U.S. government to approve a treaty language.
So thank you for the correction. An accord, for epidemiologists, these words feel very interchangeable. But nonetheless, I'm sure there's a lot of very fine points on this that I'd welcome some illumination. But Maybe turn to Eloise from the kind of the advocacy perspective. Like, where do you see efforts on that front? Did we kind of build momentum for that after the high level meeting? I know there were some concerns during the high level meeting about some lack of, I guess, consensus and what that might portend for future efforts to negotiate agreements.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, there is a lack of consensus. And I think one of the reasons is a lot of the vested interests that are negotiating this, and I would in that description, are not approaching this from what we call, quite in a highfalutin way, a whole of government, whole of society approach. So we really need governments in particular, particularly governments from richer countries, to connect the dots and understand the politics of the situation that they're in. If they approach this and think this is zero sum, what can I get out of it? I don't want to give away sovereignty. I want to make sure that if we have a situation, I'm getting the maximum vaccines, test treatments for my people ASAP. And then in a different forum, they wonder why geopolitics is difficult. They wonder why they're not getting the support across the world on other issues of great importance. They need to start connecting the dots and understanding that the COVID-19 ramifications went far beyond the terrible loss of human life, loss of livelihoods, and terrible inequities that we saw. It's a complete breach of trust between different blocs in the world. And so if we have that kind of whole of government approach during peacetime, if you will, the kind of approach that we saw at the heart of the COVID crisis, where leaders were getting around their table, their employment ministers, their finance ministers, yes, their health ministers, but everybody else besides, and the foreign ministers too. We need that kind of political mindset and leadership mindset while negotiating this accord. This is not just something about health. The ramifications go far beyond. And until and unless governments recognize that, I'm afraid we are going to be in this square bracket situation where nothing really moves on very much. But the good news is there's a whole swathe of civil society that's very motivated to work on this. There's been many different channels of action over the last year. I think now all of that converges on the INB, and we can do our level best to get some action in the right places to put equity at the heart of whatever the outcome is.
Can I just add one point to what you said, Eloise, which is, you know, one of the real disagreements is this issue of should things be mandatory or should they be voluntary? And one of the examples WHO rolls out is there was a pandemic, influenza preparedness agreement, a so-called PIP, that was put together. And they roll that out as an example of something that was quite successful, although that has not been really tested. And of course, that was voluntary provision of products. And you know, certainly what I learned in this last pandemic, and I think it is an important lesson, is, as Jen said, we don't know if the next one's going to be less severe or more severe. But in a very severe global pandemic, it's going to be everybody out for themselves. And so if we're relying on pure voluntarism, it's going to be a challenge. And this is where some of the stuff that Wilmot talked about is, you know, can we diversify manufacturing? Can we set up a situation where, you know, we've got the ability to move products around and have those made in different parts of the world? Because otherwise it is going to be a purely sequential process. There's always going to be some sequential nature from the places that have the most science till the places that have least science. But what you want to do is have them, you know, more or less, appearing at the same time. When, we considered it a great success when the first COVID vaccines as part of COVAX were available in developing countries 39 days after the first availability in the North. The challenge is keeping that up and making sure that, you know, there is general access. So I think this is going to be one of the challenges.
Yeah, and referencing the pandemic influenza preparedness framework and its potential applicability to future scenarios, I guess one of the questions I've always had is that whether flu is the right model for thinking about other events, given that particularly when it comes to vaccines, but other medical countermeasures for flu, we have a seasonal market. And so the levers and the pull mechanisms for participation are much different than when we're talking about scenarios that we haven't even yet described or don't have existing products for, and whether the kind of what brings people to the table under those scenarios is quite different. So there's so much to work out. And I think to Eloise's point about the importance of involving not just, you know, the strict health sector, but whole of society, given all of the different areas that this touches on. And I guess there are even questions whether the mechanisms we're using to negotiate things like the Accord and others are sufficiently inclusive of these other sectors, so that we get a solution that isn't just kind of laser focused on one particular scenario or one particular sector being the kind of governmental health sector. Wilmot, lots to unpack here. I know Eloise raised an issue of sort of political will. You were a lawmaker, a member of parliament in South Africa. You have some kind of politicians' insights. Where do you think we are in terms of will and ability to generate political will, and what will it take to do that? I'm guessing many of the people tuning in today are from outside of government, and sort of what role, if any, do we play in ensuring that that happens?
So thanks for that question. So we have to remember the current global political architecture in the world is that national governments are the key actors. They're the ones who make the difference. They're the ones who commit money and funds. They're the ones who change laws in order to get us better prepared for the next pandemic. Let me also say governments don't like investing in preparedness because then nothing happens, right? You avert a crisis, nothing happens, nobody gets thanked. They like to respond. They understand that. And I think that's the reality of politics, and we must get to grips with that fact. The second thing is that governments have a constitutional responsibility to take care of their citizens first. They do. And they will do that, and that's not going to change. So the question is, what's the balance between looking after your own citizens and contributing to the global good and getting that balance right? And we've seen if you look at the entire spectrum of governments today, some got that, right? So they looked after their citizens. It helps if it's a small population when it comes to vaccination, for example. But some got that. They looked after their citizens and they contributed to the global good. But there were those who did not. And there were those on the other side of the spectrum where, especially in the developing world. So our challenge, to be very realistic, is to see whether we can change the angle so that we get the balance between national commitments and contributing to the global good. The reason why a binding stipulation matters, and matters enormously, is that we will not be able to get decentralized vaccine manufacturing right unless we understand how that system works, right? You need advanced procurement. You need advanced commitments. If you speak to the manufacturers, it's necessary to de-risk the process of vaccine manufacturing. And that's something government should do, but governments will not do that unless there's a binding commitment of some kind. Voluntarism has major limits. And so I just want to emphasize that point, that the political will, what's political will? It's finding political champions, it's changing laws, and it's putting money behind it. That's what political will is. So the advocacy that Eloise spoke about is key to getting that right. So all by way of saying that we must have a binding stipulation. Otherwise, we're going to simply repeat what we did in the past, and we're going to leave it up to companies to get together with universities, to get together with some governments to help the developing world, for example, make vaccines. And under circumstances where there's a lowering interest in pandemic preparedness at this time. So that's a challenge. I think it can happen. That is, I think vaccine manufacturing can happen, but not on the level that's required to deal with a pandemic unless we have something much stronger than simply political commitments.
Just want to pause and remind anyone who's tuning in and tuned in to feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we'll pose them to our panelists. It's there for you to ask what you wish of our esteemed speakers here. I'm going to keep the conversation going though. And Seth, maybe to kind of piggybacking off of Wilmot's comments about vaccine manufacturing, because you've been so heavily involved on the vaccine world, and just give your thoughts on sort of where we are on that. There were a number of side meetings at UNGA focused on that topic. Is that a sign of progress, or do you think it's just we're spinning our wheels? I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of where that issue is and moving forward.
Well, it's interesting. It started out with, this as a demand from countries who said, look, we understand that we didn't have access. We want access. We want facilities. And this is our number one priority. And this occurred a couple of years ago when we were still in the middle of the pandemic. And so there was investment. We ended up with 33 different vaccine manufacturing projects in Africa. And they were all initially, directed at COVID. And you can imagine we don't need 33 new COVID plants. I'm not even sure we need one. So the challenge really is not about manufacturing. I mean, you made the point, Jen, that the reason pandemic influenza is different is because there is a market, during peacetime for influenza vaccines. So what we need is to have a set of manufacturers that can produce vaccines in country that are useful in peacetime. They're going to be routine vaccines. They're going to be vaccines for other epidemic agents, and then they will be able to be used during a emergency, the capacity to be able to use during the emergency for continued production. So one of the things that my former agency, Gavi, is doing about this is we have money put aside for a pandemic vaccine pool to buy potentially more COVID vaccines. We're trying to turn that into a financing instrument that will allow a subsidization of manufacturers to produce product. Now, why is that important? When you open a new factory, the first vaccine that rolls off is going to be very expensive. It doesn't matter whether it's in the north or the south, it's going to be very expensive. So the challenge is if you want to be competitive and you don't want to distort the marketplace, you need a subsidy. And so the idea would be to put some subsidies in place for some successful manufacturers to produce routine vaccines so that they can then become, an ongoing effort that is sustainable and then be ready for the future. So this is the discussion that's been going on. It's been endorsed by the G7, and we'll see how it plays.
Eloise, and first, thank you, Seth, for illuminating us on all those kind of really the devil's in the details, as they say, and there are clearly a lot of details. And I'm just wondering, Eloise, from your perspective, have the negotiations, first of all, has the conversation post-UNGA and the negotiations around the accord, do you think that there's sufficient engagement such that we'll be able to work out not just gaining consensus on an overall global agreement, but a process for working through all of these details?
I think that the next couple of months will be crucial to test that. I think that coming out of UNGA, there is this sense of all eyes on the INB. And I do think that will have an impact in terms of how countries approach the negotiations and indeed how other parties, including CSOs, do. We're looking forward to a new draft coming out on the 16th of October, more meetings. So really, I think we have to push for ambition. And we really need to see a lot more progress and speed in months ahead. If I can just bounce off of a couple of things that both Wilmot and Seth alluded to, this notion of pandemic preparedness is in and of itself a bit of a problematic concept. Pandemic is a word people don't want to hear. Preparedness gives this sort of sense of stagnation and, we're saving for a rainy day. And it's not potentially relevant in a world where there's so many pulls on money and time. So one of the ways that we're trying to be relevant and show policymakers that and political leaders that actually there is a bunch of win-wins here. You know, obviously there's the overall point about if you prepare properly, you'll save all the pain, the cost, and the human lives that we lost during COVID, which we don't really talk enough about. And I think there's an important psychological angle to that as well, about us wanting to forget. But there's also ways of doing it in this sense of this always on agenda, which is bubbling to the surface, which is if we look at what a future health system looks like, whether it's in low and middle income countries or indeed in richer countries across the world, there's going to be a future of more injectables for everybody. So let's get the adult vaccination programs more routinely organized. Let's get clinical trials networks up to scratch all over the world, so we don't have that terrible imbalance that they're all done in or the lion's share is done in rich countries. That will be better for the effectiveness of those countermeasures in future. And let's just get the systems ready, including the healthcare workers, the building community trust, all of those things that are so important. And I also just wanted to flag as well that when we think about preparing for the future, there's always that tendency, the famous adage that we shouldn't prepare for the last war. And I think that, you know, the extra challenge post-COVID is that we're seeing governments behave differently already. So the EU has signed deals with pharma companies for vaccines that they don't know what they'll be tackling yet. So you've got this kind of buy-up that's happening really in advance of anything even happening. So what does a pandemic accord do about that? How do you insert equity into this whole new post-COVID conversation? I think these are really difficult questions, but we have to look to the future and really understand how we're going to deal with those political realities.
Thank you for taking on both the kind of fraught nature of, you know, thinking about pandemics versus preparedness, given the level of fatigue and, you know, even sort of political pushback on that. And I very much share your vision that what we're talking about here is building infrastructures and capacities that function in the day-to-day and make us better at the day-to-day, that then when there's emergencies snap into place to resiliently so that we don't become overwhelmed. So this is about getting better at our day-to-day, and the range of potential threats is not just limited to pandemics. I mean, we have you know, rising infectious diseases across the globe, you know, vector-borne diseases on the rise due to changing climate, you know, heat and other storm emergencies, sending, you know, waves of people to you know, hospitals and healthcare facilities. It's about building an infrastructure that is prepared for future life and current life, and not the ones that not the lives that we lived 100 years ago. So very much thank you for that. Really very much share that vision. And I think we do have to think about how we're talking about these things such that it's not just saving for a rainy day and hope to never use it. I'm going to turn to the question and answer. There's a number of questions have arrived. So I'm just going to go down the list here. So the first one says the U.S. has been challenged to sustain biomanufacturing capability and capacity over the 20+ year course of the Civilian Medical Countermeasures Program. What lessons are learned that can be applied to newer global efforts to durable biomanufacturing, and then recognizing arguably the influenza vaccine example is important, but not sufficient. So I'm just going to let whoever wants to make sure we get through these questions if we can, just whoever wants to chime in, maybe Seth, this sounds like up your.
Happy to jump in. And I think the issue is, if we go back to what happened around COVID-19, we thought that maybe we would have an excess capacity of around 2 billion doses. And, you know, in 2021, industry was able to produce 11 billion doses. It was a really extraordinary effort. And what was interesting is some of the things that were prepared that by governments to be available as surge capacity didn't work. And we ended up, you remember, Emergent as a contract manufacturer having all kinds of problems. And so the challenge, and this is where the vision of the future is, to try to increase the diversity of manufacturing facilities that are in peacetime working and having quality and being in a good place. It doesn't guarantee, and a later question will ask this, it doesn't guarantee that it's going to be made available, but it does help with the availability, because if you have different manufacturers in different places, you can move forward. A good example can be what happened in India. India got a tech transfer early on. It was originally for global manufacturing. It ended up India, when it got bad, decided to keep it there, but they were able to vaccinate, the largest population in the world completely through those manufacturing facilities. If we had facilities like that in other places and helping with other diseases, and to Eloise's and your point, I think it's really critical about building those resilient health systems so that we have the delivery for it, the resilient supply chains. And the best way to do that is not to build them for pandemics, theoretically separate, parallel track, is to build our strong primary healthcare systems, because they're useful all the time. They'll get investments from, government and international bodies, and they will be there to be able to deliver. And I'll just finish by saying, people talk about all the problems in the developing world, but, they ended up with 56% primary vaccine coverage with COVID, at the end of 2022, and they delivered almost 10 times the number of vaccines they had ever delivered before in a year through their systems. These were not delivered by outside people, by and large. They were delivered. Now, health workers were stretched. There were huge challenges. So building those stronger, resilient systems, having them extended out to the last mile, that's really the way to go.
Great, thank you. The next question sort of pushes back, I think, on the whole binding aspect, and maybe I'll turn to you, Wilmot, on this, because you talked about the importance of having binding commitments. I think it's questioning whether things are truly binding and whether they would be in fact binding in an emergency when, as we've pointed out already, governments kind of their primary responsibility is to their own populations, and would the commitments they made in fact be true commitments? So would welcome your thoughts on that, Wilmot.
So our UN system and global bodies essentially set norms, kind of standards in support of what national governments ought to do. Given the nature of this world today, and if you look at just foreign affairs and how that's structured and how global affairs are structured, it's not enough simply to have norms. What you require when it comes to sample sharing, information sharing, patents, and technology, to have something stronger than a voluntary commitment. And in our view, that requires binding stipulation in an accord. This is what we're working towards. So, and I am dubious that we'll get that just because of the nature of this world and its politics. But we have to get somewhere close to that, because a simple voluntary arrangement is simply not enough. So maybe we have to get smart about what the plan B is. If you're not successful with binding stipulation, what is plan B? And it has to be organized on a regional basis. It has to do with what Seth was talking about, in having collaboration between the private sector and the public sector and the political world on a regional basis, so that we can have some successes on which to build heading towards the future. So I don't want to see the binding agreement requirement as something that will just be fixed in a single stroke. It's going to be a process, and we need to do that.
Wilma, can I just build a little bit on this topic and reference an earlier comment you made about government's primary responsibilities are to their populations, and so what would your kind of charge to governments be in terms of fulfilling their primary responsibilities to their populations? As we see, I mean, one of the reasons why we at the Pandemic Center, we're called the Pandemic Center and not the Epidemic Center, is not because we don't care about epidemics, but because pandemics, when they happen, they affect everybody, many places at once. And so that changes the kinetics of the response, such that whatever central resources there are, whatever globally available resources there are, now suddenly have to be divided up among the world. And, as we've all acknowledged, it's very much, unfortunately, everyone for themselves at some level. And so what would your charge to governments be for what they need to do to take care of their populations.
So governments control legislation and they control
Mm.
public funding. And they also are able to set in motion a platform for better cooperation with the private sector in a One Health response to pandemics. And so if you want to ensure that you're better prepared for the next pandemic, and we know the story, increasing cycles, there has to be a systematic increase in investment in preparedness. And it can't simply be spending more money this year on a public health institute than you did last year. It's not simply that, based on inflation and whatever. So we have to rethink the whole question of financing pandemics on a local level in areas that governments can prevent. First of all. Secondly, is to gear up foreign affairs better. Foreign affairs departments are not, I mean, there's great variation in the world, obviously, but they are not geared to deal with this, and they're not geared enough in terms of dealing with the WTO, for example. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole range of strategic changes that have to happen in an organized way in areas that national governments actually control. Because in the end, the global system is simply there as a support. It's simply there to set the rules. And we want stronger rules, better rules, but in the end, governments can control those things.
Seth, your hand is up. Please feel free to chime in.
Just to add, I mean, also being practical. So one is to increase the capacity so you have more ability to do things. But the other is, I mean, if you look at what the strategy was in COVID, it started out saying, look, everybody's going to do their high-risk populations immediately. That's okay. But don't do your lowest risk populations before others have access to high risk populations. And so it's, you know, you can't expect that countries won't do something, but, you know, we had terrible vaccine nationalism where some countries said, you know, I don't care about anybody else. I'm going to vaccinate every single one of my citizens, even the absolute lowest risk. Now, of course, if you're doing that and the pandemic is spreading in other places and you're seeing variants, you know, appear, what you're going to end up with is more threat to your country. And so this is one of the challenges. It's a change in mindset that says it is a global problem and we have to have a global solution, not a country by the most powerful countries. But, you know, obviously on top of that, you'd like to have legal, and I agree with Wilmot. I'm not sure we'll get there, but even if we don't get there, we can build enough redundancy in the system such that we won't have the inequities we had last time.
So if I may
please.
just add very quickly, is say the one thing that we do control is training. So we need to do three things in today, actually 4 things. We need to invest in the next generation of healthcare professionals, and we need to net them globally. And universities do that. So, you know, so that is in our control, and that's what excites me actually about the future, is to have civil cooperation through universities with governments to train the next generation of healthcare professionals. We can do that. It's within our control, and we should invest in it. That's the first thing. The second is to beef up and upscale surveillance systems. That's the second one. And the third is to decentralize vaccine manufacturing. Those are the 3 things. Then we have to do all of that secure in what we call a biosecurity shield. We want to protect care workers, and we want to make sure that pathogens are kept in safe hands so that they don't do damage. At the heart of all of this is people. And the people are tired of COVID-19. So we need to restore. We need to restore just on the mental health side. We need to do all manner of things. We need to take care of our frontline health workers. We thank them when they do their work, and then we forget about them. There has to be a systematic rebuilding of trust between healthcare workers. And we have to invest in people, I think is the key message. And that's what gives me hope coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you for that very tangible, actionable list. And before I go to the next question, because you referenced trust, and the next question sort of gets at that. Eloise, just wondering from the advocacy perspective, your reactions to Wilmot's list, and if you think that's the right agenda. Is it on the agenda?
Yeah, I would concur with everything Wilmot said, and just to ping back quickly to this, the discussion about the pandemic accord and this notion of legally binding. I think whether or not we get there, how strong it is in the end, it's so important to set a standard of a level playing field. I mean, one of the starkest situations that I experienced personally during the COVID years is that day. I live in Belgium. I'm a British and Belgian citizen. And the day on 26th of November 2021, when the news came that Omicron had been found for the first time in Europe in Belgium. And I thought, well, they closed the borders to some African countries. Are they going to close the Belgian borders? No, they didn't. So like this double standard that it was a complete kind of free for all in terms of, well, it's one standard over here and it's another standard over here. I'm not saying it will disappear completely, but it will help level set some of that and help bring the politics and the equity to a sort of legal standard that will help some of that be organized. Back to Wilmot's list, I think this point about health education, healthcare workers, that brings me to one of the questions that one of our attendees has posed about misinformation. We had a saying in Pandemic Action Network in 2020 that until we have a vaccine and until we have the good, equitable spread of countermeasures, our tool is communications. And that's everybody's tool, is communications. What we're saying to people, the advice that we're giving, that authorities are giving, how can we as CSOs best navigate that, understand how to put that forward? So it's really, really important to build that trust and those communication feedback loops as part of the work that we do for future preparedness as well. So just wanted to make that point.
That's a great segue to the next question, which is about how do you do this work in politically divided countries, reference the United States, but the US was not only the only one. I mean, we saw political divisions in multiple countries. There's a subsequent question that talks about the future application of non-pharmaceutical interventions, given the politicization and also the pushback, the tremendous amount of pushback. So just open it up to whomever would like to chime in, but any thoughts on how we tackle that, address that? I take your point, Eloise, about communication, but just wondering if there are any other thoughts on moving forward.
I mean, it seems to me that trust is the critical issue here, and it's trust for science. So we had many countries that trusted their scientists, their public health leaders, their political leaders, and then we had a whole range of countries, not just the U.S., where there was misinformation. And you know, the challenge is how do we get back to a place where people follow science? And you know, it's going to be critical. I mean, the mortality rate of this disease vis-a-vis pandemics is relatively low. And imagine if we had something that had a 40% or 50% mortality rate, you would see, you know, a panic to a level, you know, one higher. The only thing that protects you at that point is science. And the hardest problem of science at that moment in time is we don't know the answers. So you may give an answer that's the best available answer at that moment, and then that answer may change. And of course, when you politically want to challenge, that's where you challenge. You say, look, yesterday you said this and today you said that, but that is going to be the nature of it. So it requires a trust of society. And when you have political leaders that are trying to use these types of things to affect the trust in the society, it is a real problem. So to me, you know, that is kind of the prerequisite for where we need to be to solve this problem, but we're far, far away from it right now.
Well, I'm wondering if I could ask you to weigh in on this. You helped build post-apartheid South Africa from within government. And so you've seen very stark political divides and the work that follows that you put into place to overcome that, or not fully overcome, but to address that. I'm just wondering if you have any insights from your experiences.
So the point about South Africa was that there was an agreement between the leaders on both sides of the spectrum that we needed peace. And when you have that commitment, it's possible. You'll see what happens in other parts of the world where there was no strong commitment to having peace. And so the conflict continues. And that's what made the difference. And once you have that commitment, then you can work at the details. And it's not easy, but that's possible. What's happened recently in politics is that leaders are winning elections by dividing populations, not by uniting them. And we've seen this happen, where the electoral strategy, in fact, is to divide, because divide brings returns in terms of being able to win. And I hope that comes to an end at some point. The problem with the political world is that you get the leaders that populations elect. You get them. You don't appoint them. There's no CV in front of you who you screen. So our job is to try and contain people who are dangerous. That's the job that you need to take. So I'm not hopeful on that front in terms of getting a new generation of leaders who don't win elections by dividing populations. I think what we need to do in response to those sorts of situations is to have some entity, a public health entity, that is insulated from the pressures of politics, that stands above it, or has enough guarantees that minimizes political interference. So in a way, you need a much stronger, much more insular, much more protected US Center for Disease Control, and the same with other public health agencies. And then to work hard on a local level to make sure that there's a sort of a cadre of public health officials that are insulated from politics. And I think that's possible to build.
Okay, I'm turning to the next question here. I'm just kind of scrolling down to see some of these we've kind of covered at some level. Oh, here's a question about moving forward. Do we see any synergies between the Pandemic Accord and the Pandemic Fund? Maybe turn to Eloise, your thoughts on that.
I think there should definitely be connectivity, but the truth is that the Pandemic Fund needs 10.5 billion a year. It's nudging 2 billion in terms of it where the funding is right now. And the 10.5 billion a year is by no means adequate for global pandemic prevention, preparedness and response funding. So it's really important to note that this is really Pandemic Fund's conception was about filling critical gaps in low middle income countries, but is a partial answer to the financing needs. And so it would be envisaged that really the Pandemic Accord would need a lot of domestic resource investment, a lot of international investment, and a whole swathe of different kinds of financing to make all its provisions come to life. And I think that's just to bring another angle into this conversation. One of the things that we've been doing at Pandemic Action Network is very much trying to bring pandemics, health more broadly, but particularly that whole of government, whole of society approach to pandemics into the multilateral development bank conversation to say, look, this is where there's a lot of activity, a lot of political energy. There is the unlocking, an active unlocking of finance at scale. And this is the kind of thing we need for end-to-end health systems, also for those investments in things like the manufacturing sectors, like the supply chain needs. So we really need to sort of bring our advocacy concerns, our advocacy asks, and our mission to the places where there are political energy and where finance is being discussed. So there's several tracks to our work really in the next year. Firstly, we need to kind of nurture that core pandemic PPR agenda, this pandemic prevention, preparedness and response agenda through the Pandemic Accord, push really hard to get the Pandemic Fund capitalized, and on top of that, make sure governments are doing a lot more both nationally and in their region and globally. But secondly, these related agendas, how can we bring pandemics into that multilateral space? How do we make the connections with climate change and the fact that climate will lead to more outbreaks? And what does that mean in terms of climate adaptation finance as well? So there's many different angles to our work, the core agenda, and making sure we relate it to where a lot of other political activity and energy is taking place.
This next question has a quote here. It says, your thoughts on the famous quote by security expert Richard Clarke, democracies don't prepare well for things that have never happened before. And then adding the addition, and things that one does not know when they will happen again. I'd love your thoughts on that. I will just say, as a kind of plug for some of the work that our Pandemic Center is doing, we are actually trying to look at this very specific issue, which is how should democracies prepare for future pandemics, given the strengths of democracies, as well as the potential limitations of being in a democratic society. I don't think there are many limitations, but nonetheless, it is, how do you respond when everybody does expect some level of voice in what's happening? And so that is something that we're doing, looking in the context of the United States, and we're trying to harvest lessons from communities that didn't just take, a black and white approach. They did what worked for them, and we want to understand what worked for them so that we can build a larger menu of options for communities to consider that aren't just these binary, you either shut things down or you don't care type approaches or narrative that I think many kind of wave their hands and kind of wave away pandemic preparedness as being either one of those two things, when in fact there are many different possible approaches that can be taken. And so it's our job, I think, to build a larger, more operationally feasible, more community tailored menus. So anyway, just kind of stay tuned, watch this space, but would welcome Serge's brief remarks. We only have a few minutes left.
Just to say quickly, it isn't only in security. I mean, if you look at health, we don't value prevention as much as we value treatment. And, so people will spend very little on the prevention side of things until they get sick, and then they'll do anything to try to get better. And I think humans don't do this well, which is why you have to have a special attempt to try to keep this on the agenda and drive it forward. And as you just said, Jen, is to really work on building communities, understanding their knowledge and their ways of doing things going forward.
A single sentence from me, I would say that autocracies are also very bad at preparing. It's not a democracy, autocracy axis here we're talking about. The challenge for free societies, we love to live in free societies, I don't want to live in an autocracy, is to get the balance between individual rights and the common good, get that balance right. And I think it's possible. So that's what we need to work on.
Any last thoughts on that, Eloise?
Yeah, and I think related to that, this idea that actually to serve your individual rights in the best way, it needs international action. It's not actually an act of charity, it's an act of self-interest. If we'd have had a strategy for the most vulnerable people and in a vaccine rollout during COVID, or stuck to a strategy that definitely existed, we would have all gotten out of lockdown earlier. So that's worth thinking on. It's a communications challenge again, how we deliver that message. But the final thought is, it's not done. We've got time to make change happen. And if anybody on this call is interested in engaging, advocating, Pandemic Action Network is an open door, and we've got a strong agenda for action, and we will make some change in that pandemic accord.
Thank you for that. And we will be sharing additional resources to everyone who registered here. And with that, given the time, I would like to thank our panelists and everyone who joined us today for this really great conversation about a most important topic. I think a theme of our discussions was about how we can all roll up our sleeves to make sure we advocate for an appropriate pandemic preparedness agenda. Making sure we take ownership of that word and define it as we think it should be defined, and to make sure that the momentum continues and that it doesn't fall off the radar or country's agenda. If you would like to share this event with anyone who was unable to attend, the recordings will be posted on the event page of our website next week. You can also find recordings of previous webinars there. Please follow our social media accounts to learn about all of our events and future webinars. And those social media accounts are on the screen right now. And please also reach out to the email address on the screen if you have any questions or suggestions for future webinars and our Pandemics and Societies series. And once again, thanks to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to my Pandemic Center colleagues who made this webinar possible. And thanks to everyone who's listening and engaging with this content going forward and sharing it to your colleagues and others that you think would be interested. So with that, thank you all. Be safe, be healthy, and stay engaged. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen, for moderating.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.